Good morning, and my name is Sagar Shah. I'm from London, and this morning's session is going to be on ethical and environmental issues in modern food production and how Jainism can help. So just a bit about me for those who don't know me. I was born, raised, and brought up in London, UK. I was working in New York in 2007, and I ended up attending the JAINA convention in New Jersey at the Raritan Expo Center in 2007. That convention inspired a lot of changes for me, which led me to volunteer a lot back in the Jain community in the UK. It led to me changing towards a vegan diet in 2007. Yesterday was my 10-year vegan anniversary. I was thinking about what to do to celebrate this occasion earlier in the year, and then I got an invitation letter inviting me to speak at this convention, and I'm really delighted to be here, to be able to share some of the insights that I've learned over the last 10 years and help share what I've learned to help others in the community live, I hope, in a more peaceful and non-violent way, which is less damaging towards the planet. So a bit more about me in terms of what's relevant for this talk. So I studied Jainism at the Sri Chandna Vidyapith Jain School under the guidance of Acharya Chandnaji in London. And I also attended the International Summer School for Jain Studies in 2013. I have previously worked for an environmental campaign group in the UK called Friends of the Earth and an environmental think tank called the New Economics Foundation. And in the UK, I'm also a trustee and director of the Vegan Society. So that sort of is the basis for what I've learned and what I'm going to be sharing. So a question for you. Please, well, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but please raise your hands if you believe that we as a community, we as the Jain community, should try and eat in a more ethical and sustainable way. Fantastic. We all believe that is true. Now, within the community, there's a lot of wisdom on how to live our lives and eat food in an ethical way. But in the last 200 years, there have been a huge number of technological changes that the food that we obtain, that we buy, and the food that we eat is produced in a way which is different to how it is produced historically, and essentially includes some violence and environmental damage that we are not aware of because it is hidden from us. So the aim of this talk is to not focus on the wisdom that already exists within the community, but to help raise awareness of more modern issues that exist. So I'm going to go through some of the environmental and ethical issues in modern food production and discuss how Jain principles can help. And I very much hope that you'll all learn something new that leads to some change in your lives in some way. Now, a bit of a disclaimer. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is based on my knowledge of the UK and Europe. And some of the foods, while there'll be a lot of things that are relevant for North America and true also for North America, I'm not 100% familiar with all the supply chains here. So some things I will give you the basis for you to take home, but there'll be some research required. I'm also not very familiar with the pros and cons of GM food. That's mainly because in Europe, the production of GM crops is largely banned, with exception to one maize crop in Spain and it's a pest-resistant potato variety that exists in Europe. Other than that, there's pretty much no GM production in Europe, so I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of this. But I understand it's a bigger issue in North America, so I'm not covering it in today's talk. So, just an outline of what we're going to go over today. The first is the general challenge? So I'll highlight that, and then I'm going to go through some specific food types. So dairy production, organic food. We hear a lot about this. Is it better? Should we be seeking to buy organic food? Then there are other foods like palm oil, which are associated with primary rainforest deforestation. There's seasonal vegetables. The technology we have allow us to buy and produce food even though it's not natural for a particular time of year. Look a bit about air-freighted foods and food waste, and finally we'll go on to how JAIN principles can help. So, a question to you. Any guesses? How much of the world's land do we dedicate for food production? Any guesses from the floor? 10%?
60%.
60%.
80%.
80%. Okay. So it sounds like no one in the audience knows. The answer is around 40%. But when we take that 40% into consideration, it's important to note that actually a lot of the world's land we can't grow crops on. So you've got mountainous land where you can't grow crops. And so it's 40% of land, but most of that land's not actually usable at all. Now, when we grow food on land and we use it for agriculture, whether it's to grow crops that we eat ourselves or crops that are used to feed animals, we're displacing other forms of life. And that means there's less areas for the other creatures we share the planet with to feed and to use for their own purposes. And livestock farming in particular is one that's very intensive because we grow crops to feed to animals and then use them for human food. So any solution which involves reducing our impact on the planet and harm to other living beings must require using less land. So the general solutions and the general principles throughout this talk, one is just to eat less. Second is to choose foods that require fewer resources, and then also to choose foods which are less destructive or violent. And this is a theme that will come out throughout today's talk. So the first particular issue I'm going to discuss in today's talk is dairy products, and I'm going to cover both the environmental issues and the ethical issues covering dairy. Now, just to give you a flavor of the environmental impact of dairy products, imagine a cup of tea. Because actually, for a lot of people in the Indian community, tea and coffee is the main way in which we consume dairy products. Most of us want milk in our chai. So, again, guess from the audience, a cup of tea or coffee. There are lots of things that go into making a cup of tea or coffee. The main things are growing the actual leaves or the coffee beans, wherever they are in the world, bringing them over to the US or the UK. Then we boil the water to produce it, and then we add a splash of milk. So if we think about the contribution to greenhouse gases, any guesses on how much is coming from the bit of milk, the very small dash of milk we add in our tea?
Just to say that in some Indian families, it's 50-50 milk and water. It's not a little splash of milk.
Okay.
It can be a higher
So the data I produce is based on only a small dash of milk. Any guesses from the audience? For English tea. Yeah, any guesses from the audience?
70%.
70%? Too high. Yeah? Anyone else?
20%.
20%.
For English tea.
English tea. Okay. So, this chart splits out the CO2 equivalent emissions for making a cup of tea. The actual production of the tea leaves and transporting them to where we are is only about 3 of the 55 grams of carbon we emit in making a cup of tea. Boiling water contributes 18, roughly 40%. 60% of the emissions, and well done Christian for coming up with the right answer, comes from just adding a small splash of milk. Now, as Gina mentioned, actually a lot of us in Indian families, we make very milky tea, we make milky coffee. Many of us also go to coffee shops where we have lattes because we've developed a taste for that. If you get a large latte, we've got 55 from a regular cup of tea or coffee that is just produced with a splash of milk. If we get a large latte from Starbucks, that goes up to 340. It's about 6 times higher the environmental damage by having more milk. The reason for this is that animals are an incredibly inefficient way to produce food for humans. Animals need to stay warm. They're just like us. Their bodies stay at a very warm temperature. They need to eat a lot to keep warm and perform all their functions. They need to grow in order to, in particular for milk production, they need to grow and become adults. So all that energy we grow from the ground goes into them growing, and then we only extract a little bit that gets used for food. And in milk production in particular, cows, they produce a lot of methane, which is a lot more potent in terms of its contribution to global warming. So of all livestock, livestock accounts for about 15% of total greenhouse gas emissions, and cows account for 60% of this due to the methane that they produce. So just as a comparison of the differences between soya is the most commonly used alternative to cow milk, when you think about the environmental differences between soya and cow's milk, if you look at the amount of land that gets used, it's only around the third. Sulfur dioxide is a gas that contributes towards acid rain, the degradation of our environment. It's only about 20%. Nitrous oxide is another pollutant. It's basically nothing from soy milk compared to cow's milk. And when it comes to carbon dioxide, you're looking at around a third, less than a third of the contribution to greenhouse gases associated with using soy instead of cows. So a vegan diet, a diet which is associated, based on typical diets in the UK, a vegan diet is roughly 25% fewer emissions than a lacto-vegetarian diet that most of us consume in the West. Now, the environmental differences aren't the only difference, the reason for avoiding dairy. We've also got violence in milk production as well. And there are different forms of violence. Many people will talk about factory farming and the harm caused with factory farming. I believe Vandana, in the talk just after mine, is going to shed a bit more light on this. But whatever the form of production, there are 3 forms of violence which are inherent in all types of production. These are the forced pregnancy of cows through artificial insemination, the immediate killing of male calves, and the premature killing of retired dairy cows. And I'm just going to go into a bit more explaining why this happens and show a video to demonstrate I'm not making this up. This was shown on live TV in the UK. So cows, just like humans, they produce milk for their babies. In order to produce milk, they need to be pregnant. And every time they're made pregnant, a baby comes. Now, many of us may think the way in which that pregnancy takes place is by bringing together a cow and a bull in a field, and then they form a relationship and they live happily ever after. No, that's not what happens. Us as humans have taken control over the process to make sure that cows get pregnant every year, and so we forcefully make them pregnant through a process called artificial insemination. Form of violence number 1. Now, when a calf gets born, that calf can be either a male or a female. The females can go on and be kept for milk production just like their mothers. But the males have got no value to farmers. In order to keep a male calf alive, they need to eat a lot of food, a lot of water, you require land to look after them, and you need to pay veterinary bills. It's very expensive. It's easier to just use them for meat or to kill them straight away. So these male calves are wasted as a result of the dairy industry. So they're just killed, often within days of being born. Now, a dairy cow could live to about 15 or 20 years if looked after properly. But unfortunately, what happens is that after about 3 or 4 lactations, the amount of milk they produce begins to fall. And at this point, they've already given birth to a female that's now old enough to start producing milk themselves. So they tend to just get sent to be killed at the age of between 5 and 7 years old. So this is the third form of killing in milk production. Now, if you take these 2 forms, the killing of male calves and the premature killing of dairy cows, I've worked out, using the numbers, I'm an economist by profession, so I love crunching numbers. I've worked out that by consuming 4 pints of milk or 200 grams of cheese, we contribute to the killing of cows and male calves that's equivalent to eating a quarter pound of steak. Now, we as a Jain community, if we were to see a member of our families or our children eating a quarter pound of steak, we would be horrified. But in actual fact, by consuming milk products and consuming dairy products like cheese, we are in effect contributing to the killing of cows in exactly the same way. It's very important that we educate ourselves about what is going on and we understand the realities of this milk production, because it's very unfortunate that we as a community are contributing to this process through the choices we make. And it's very difficult to do anything to change how these practices are, but we can make a stand by avoiding dairy products and not contributing to it. Now, some people, I'm just going to bring up dairy production in India, as many of us, we're from the Indian community, and this is something we're interested in. I actually spent a summer working for ICICI Bank in India, where I got put on a project to develop loan products for dairy farmers in India. So I got the opportunity to interview farmers up and down throughout Gujarat, Mehsana, Banaskantha, Gandhinagar, and so forth, and learn about what was taking place in dairy farms. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what I observed about the treatment of cows, but on the issue of cows used in milk production getting killed, there are two things that I'd like you all to take away, for those of you that might not believe this is an issue in India. First question, who is the largest beef exporter in the world?
Brazil.
So, both answers are correct, based on 2016 data from the US Department of Agriculture. Both India and Brazil had the largest exports of beef in the world. But unlike Brazil, where there is a dedicated beef industry, India doesn't have a dedicated beef industry. Cows and buffaloes aren't raised in India to be used for beef. And so those cows and buffaloes that are exported are actually a result of dairy production. Now, on the specific issue of the killing of male calves, some people think this won't happen in India. Maybe it's just the older dairy cows that will get retired and they just got abandoned and then they get picked up by some Muslim people, perhaps. I've heard a lot of people saying that, blaming it on people from other cultures, rather than looking at ourselves. But what ratio of males to females would you expect to see if there was no killing of male calves in India? 50-50? Anyone think you'd see anything else? So I looked at some data from the Indian Ministry of Agriculture on the number of females and male cows and buffaloes that are alive in India based on surveys of different farms up and down the country. And you have 216 million female cows and buffaloes and 84 male cows and buffaloes. What's happened to these missing male cows and buffaloes? These are the animals that have ended up getting slaughtered. Right now, there are 132 million missing males and females. And that's just the number today. Most of these females will be giving birth every year. So that death toll is actually a flow. So you've got maybe 100 million getting killed every single year as a result of India's taste for dairy products. It's a huge problem. So, for the end of my first part, which is looking at dairy consumption, the solution, my recommendation to you all, if you're not already avoiding dairy, please give up dairy as soon as possible. Replace dairy with a plant-based alternative, such as those made from soya, coconut, almond, cashew, hemp, or rice. And don't just do it yourselves, encourage others to do so, and give support animal charities like Mercy for Animals that are going to be speaking afterwards, that do animal advocacy work and raise awareness and help encourage and move other people towards a more compassionate form of lifestyle. Organic food. Now, hands up if you think we should aim to eat more organic food. Cool? About half the audience, I'm not sure everyone else. So, the pros for organic food, that they tend not to use any artificial fertilizers or artificial pesticides, and they encourage crop diversity. But the bad side, unfortunately, is that instead of using petroleum-based fertilizers, it's actually very common in both in Europe and in the US for animal blood and bones to be used as fertilizers instead. Some people, after hearing about what happens to cows on dairy farms, decide that organic milk is the best way forward. But actually, unfortunately, even under organic standards, cows and calves are just killed just like in conventional milk production. And on pesticides, they introduce predatory insects to deal with pests rather than using chemicals. And also the amount of land use. So often, without the use of fertilizers, the amount of land used in organic farming is around 20% lower. So I think we're stuck in a difficult position because no form of agriculture for foods that we buy in the shops is perfect, and we need to just face up to that reality. From my opinion, there's no easy solution. In the UK, we've got a movement called the Vegan Organic Network. And so rather than using the blood and bones from animals, they only use green fertilizers that actually come from plant matter and waste plant matter. And this form of farming seems to be much more aligned with Jain principles than other forms of conventional farming. But again, the amount of land used for crops tends to be more, but we can sort of offset that by using the most efficient crops to feed ourselves, but it's also very hard to get hold of these products in the UK. So if you live near an vegan organic farm, you can get hold of it, but otherwise it's actually very difficult.
I wanted to just mention what I've heard about veganic farming in the US at the right time, so tell me when it's a good time.
Sure, so I don't know very much about it. I imagine it's in line, veganics are in line with the same principles, but if you want to say something about that, please do.
So in US, it's a very small movement also, veganic farming, and some of it is concentrated in the Northern California area, but other places as well. What I've heard about it is that it is smaller yields, And it may, we haven't heard from the people that I've spoken with about this. There's an organization called Seed the Commons. So the people from Seed the Commons haven't specifically said that it uses more land, but they've said that it's better over time for sustainability. So, I mean, I think we could consider looking at the time dimension as well as the space dimension of the impacts of veganic farming. But certainly it's small scale, it's harder to get, it's not something you can go to your supermarket and buy now. The other thing I think we could consider thinking about is just Jainism generally prohibits farming. How come Jains haven't developed some way of farming that's more nonviolent? You know, thinking about the occupational traditions that we have in the modern world. So that's something I think we could think about as a community.
Thank you very much, Gina. So these, I'm sharing my thoughts and my recommendations. So on balance, I still think that organic, it's not perfect by any means, but given limited availability, organic fruits, vegetables, and grains are still probably better than the conventional alternatives we have available to us. But because we acknowledge that they've got lower yields, we should make an active choice to choose foods that are less damaging for the environment, and we'll come to some thoughts on these a little bit later. Another thing we can do is, if we've got gardens and we've got the space and time, we can consider growing our own vegetables. By doing so, we can be confident about what goes into them, but we'll also educate ourselves a bit more about food production, and it will help with the choices made later on. I think we can also support organizations that are promoting vegan organic farming methods, like the Vegan Organic Network in the UK and Veganic in the US. Now, third issue, deforestation from palm oil and soya. Some of you may have heard about the plight of orangutans in Borneo and in Malaysia and Indonesia. So palm oil is a very, very widely used product, food crop. It is incredibly efficient in terms of the amount of oil that gets produced in a single acre of land, which makes it very cheap and cost-effective, which is why it's so popular. And unfortunately, it's used in many foods, including dairy alternatives to butter. And worst of all, it's not very clearly labelled. But it's not very good for us. It's high in saturated fat, and it's associated with primary rainforest deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia. Soya, the soybean, also gets a lot of bad press coverage because in Brazil, it's often that parts of the rainforest are cut down in order to grow soybeans, but actually most of those soybeans are used for animal feed rather than for food production. So on the question mark of whether we need palm oil, I'm giving you my personal assessment based on the reading that I've been doing. I don't think that either palm oil or soya are really necessary for our diets. But with palm oil in particular, I think most of us eat more fat than we need. Most of us should be looking to cut down on processed foods which are high in saturated fat. And if we want to eat fat, we should probably be eating healthy sources like whole nuts and seeds and avocados, rather than derivatives of refined oils. Whereas if you look at soya, and most of us, we need protein. Many of us in the community may not be eating as much protein as is healthy for us. If you look at the amount of usable protein we get per amount of land we use for food production, soya is one of the best crops to be eating. It is the amount of food you get per unit of land is very high. So my recommendation would be to avoid palm oil as far as possible. Where foods are labeled just vegetable fat, they don't make it clear the type of fat that's being used. A good way of guessing whether it contains palm oil is to look at the saturated fat content. If it's more than 30%, the chances are it is palm oil. It could also be coconut oil, but in those cases, the coconut oil will be generally be labeled because it's associated positively. Whereas soya's, I actually think it's a pretty good food in terms of land use, and it's the true for most pulses and grains, most pulses. So if you're going to go for soya, try and go for lightly processed soya foods. That includes soya milk and tofu. And try and go for a production method that is transparent, so you can try and avoid using soya products that are grown in areas with deforestation. Next issue, we're going to be looking at food specific. So it's not really about the type of food, and we're now looking at how food is actually produced and where it comes from. So, question for you all. What has a higher carbon footprint? A kilogram of beef or a kilogram of tomatoes? Beef? Hands up if you think it's beef. Hands up if you think it's tomatoes. 3, 4. Okay. It's a bit of a trick question. Sorry. Carbon footprint sorry, I should have defined this. Refers to this carbon dioxide equivalent emissions associated with producing food, and that is scaled according to its contributions to the greenhouse effect and global warming. So it's the contribution, it's a way of measuring the contribution towards climate change. Now, it was a trick question because it's very common for people to say that beef is really bad for the environment. But in actual fact, depending on the way in which our plant foods are produced, they can also be really bad for the environment as well. So this chart explains, depending on how the foods are produced, the different environmental impacts. If you're thinking about local tomatoes that have been grown in summer, the impact towards climate change and greenhouse gas emissions is incredibly low. And that's, so you're talking about 0.4 kilograms for a kilogram of tomatoes compared to 18 kilograms for a kilogram of beef. But if the tomatoes are produced in winter, when there isn't natural sunlight, so they wouldn't naturally grow in winter, and they're grown in a greenhouse which is heated throughout the winter to enable the fruits and the fruit to come in the middle of winter, that environmental impact goes up to 50 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of tomatoes. That's almost 3 times as bad for the environment as a kilogram of beef. And so the thing to be mindful of is that if we are eating foods that are grown out of season and we're using heating to artificially make foods that don't naturally grow at this time of year, it's a bit of a disaster for the environment. So, Jathan?
Is there, would you have any data, or maybe you think this or later, but just on fruit transported from other continents?
So that's going to be coming up as the next topic, and I've got some data on that. So as a community, if we want to try and reduce our contribution towards climate change and avoid damaging the environment, we need to be mindful about how our foods are produced. So this is an area where I'm less familiar about food production in North America. The UK is a very cold country. We don't produce that much. But in the wintertime, foods like berries, tomatoes, peppers, if they're grown in Europe, often they'll be grown in heated greenhouses, and actually they're very bad for the environment. So in actual fact, from an environmental perspective, it's actually better to have canned tomatoes. Arguably, they may not be suitable for Jains, but in terms of the environmental impact, the cost of preparing them in summer and then canning them, and preparing them for canning, is actually a lot lower than trying to grow them in winter. So in summer, actually, I think tomatoes and other fruits and vegetables, they taste better. They're also better for the environment. And during the winter, we can have other types of food. So find out about seasonality is my recommendation. I think across North America, we've definitely got them in Europe. We have box schemes where you can have seasonal fruits and vegetables delivered to you that are grown in your local area. For some foods like tomatoes, it may be better to get them canned if you're comfortable eating canned rather than fresh. And also beans and pulses, and this is a recurring theme that's going to come throughout what's left of the presentation. One of the wonderful things about beans and pulses is that when they're dried, they last a long time and they're very good for transport. So they tend to be very good for the environment in terms of the amount of land they use. They also put nitrogen into the soil, so they actually help fertilize the land that they're grown in. And because they're dried and can be prepared at any time of the year, they're actually quite good for the environment in terms of seasonal effects. So if we're eating grains in times where we can't find locally produced foods, seasonal produced foods, beans and pulses are generally very good. So next topic is, as Jepan identified, transport methods. So I've got 10 minutes, yeah, I'm coming to an end. So let's say you live in New Jersey and want to purchase some food from California. How do transport methods differ in terms of their contribution to global warming? Any guesses on what the worst form of transport for food is?
Flight.
Flying? Anyone else thinks it's anything else from flying? Okay, ocean transport by train?
Rocket ship.
Sorry, rocket ship. Yeah, yes. Rocket ship is probably the worst. No, it's not on my slide. So it is air. It is air transport is the worst. Any guesses per mile? How much worse air transportation is
Compared
to by truck? 10 times worse. Okay, here's the chart. So, in terms of transporting a mile per metric ton, this is the grams. It's per kilometer. The grams of carbon dioxide equivalent associated with different forms of transport. And air travel is particularly bad, and that's because when you are flying, the emissions are much higher up in the atmosphere, and so they contribute much more towards global warming and the greenhouse effect. And depending on the range, you're looking at about 5 times worse per mile than traveling by car or truck, and maybe 10 to 50 times worse than traveling by ship. The other thing to note about air travel is foods that are transported by air tend to be traveling much further. So not only do you get the worst impact per mile, but they're also much worse because of how far they're traveling. And so just for an example, I'm just using an example of asparagus. And again, this is based on the UK. If we're growing this in the UK locally, maybe you get for a kilogram of asparagus, that's a very big portion. You're looking at about 500 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. If we fly it in from Peru, which is a big producer of asparagus, in wintertime where we don't grow them in the UK, it goes up to 14 kilograms. So Air freighted products are an environmental disaster due to the long distances, and products that are air freighted tend to not be grown in the same country. They also tend to be highly perishable. So Indian mangoes, I'm sure most of us in the room love them when they're in season. I believe the season's about to be coming to the end. Unfortunately, they're really, really bad for the environment. In the UK, berries, asparagus, fresh flowers, all of these things tend to be air freighted. But some fruits, even though they're coming a long way, like bananas, oranges, and apples, which apples come from New Zealand, a lot of them in the UK. Actually, when they're transported by ship, the environmental damage doesn't tend to be as bad. So I'd say on the relative evil of getting a product that's far away, they tend to be not as bad. So the recommendation to try and avoid the impact is to avoid air-freighted products if possible. Go for in-season fruits that are grown locally. Dried versions, so dried mangoes are wonderful, and ones which are transported by ship or truck. And again, lentils and grains tend to be good all year round. They're non-perishable and can be, if they're coming from another country, they can be transported by ship. Last issue, and I've only got about 5 minutes left. How much of food that we buy in the West is thrown away? Any guesses? 40%. 40%? Okay, that may be true in North America and the US. In the UK, our estimates are it's about 25% of all we eat is thrown away.
It is 40.
It's 40 in the US. Okay, wow, so it's even bigger. But the solution here is really simple. Just eat what you buy, don't buy too much. And again, non-perishable foods like lentils, pulses, and whole grains are really good because they last a long time. And so if we buy them, we can just cook what we need rather than buying a big pack from the store and then not getting to finish it and as a result throwing it away. So, as a summary of the recommendations based on the talk, eat less, buy less, waste less. Avoid dairy products as much as we can, use plant-based alternatives, and within them, I believe soya is probably the best for the environment, but go for ones where the source is transparent. Avoid palm oil as far as possible. Again, the tip for that is if it's only labeled as vegetable oil and 30% of the fat is saturated, best to avoid it. Avoid air-freighted foods, air-freighted goods, and non-seasonal greenhouse gas heated foods. Go for seasonal, local, or shipped foods, and pulses and grains generally tend to be good all year round. So, how does Jainism help? Well, actually, Jainism encourages us to fast, and this helps us gain self-control over our taste buds, and so helps us to deal with wanting a particular food but not being able to eat it because it's bad at a particular time of year or because it's bad for the environment, and it helps us to be more satisfied with what we have. It encourages us to eat mindfully, which will encourage us to waste less food. And it just turns out that the foods that Jains tend to eat during Tithi days and during festivals like Ambel, the pulses and grains, just happen to be the best for the environment. So there's a lot of wisdom in the Jain tradition, and that wisdom seems to be relevant not just historically, but in the issues we face today in environmental and ethical issues in modern food production. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you have found it interesting and have learned something. Thank you very much, Simon, for listening. I'm not sure if we've got time for questions.